Part of that today is I do want to finish the discussion of what I call these household pests. We've talked about the pantry pests first. Today we're going to finish out the rest of what I consider to be the sort of the parasites, things that get blood from human beings and so forth. We've finished most of these. We've talked about the fleas, the lice, the bed bugs, but I wanted to give you sort of an introduction to the mosquitoes today. And then Nadisha will fill out some of the things that mosquitoes transmit to us next week. To begin with, remember that mosquitoes are ideal in transmitting diseases because adult mosquitoes often feed multiple times. And, oh, by the way, remember, only the female mosquito is the one that takes blood. The male mosquitoes feed on nectar out of flowers, and so it's really only the female mosquito that we're worried with. Mosquitoes are very delicate insects, and you keep wondering when you see a mosquito, how in the world can you be such a dangerous insect worldwide? But they do have these piercing, sucking mouth parts. The females typically, every time they take a blood meal, they go and sort of like a bed bug, they go and digest it, they convert it into eggs, they lay those eggs, and then they'll go take another blood meal. And so many of these adult mosquitoes can live several weeks to a month at a time. And the problem is, we know with the vectoring of diseases that insects and things like ticks and so forth are great vectors if they do feed multiple times on different animals. And so again, we've got an ideal situation where we've got an animal that can feed multiple times on different animals. And to me, it's kind of interesting. Many of the diseases that mosquitoes transmit are not actually human diseases. Many of the viruses that we deal with, things like West Nile virus, for those of you that remember when West Nile virus first came in North America, there was this massive songbird die-off. Crows were dying off, blackbirds were dying off, many of the songbirds were dying off, primarily because they're the ones that got the virus disease. And since none of the North American birds had been subjected to this African disease or African origin disease, basically they had no immunity to it, and they were taken out in large numbers. But over time, the ones that survived had the ability to withstand that disease, and so now most of our songbirds and other bird populations have recovered from that. But all that means is that if you've got a population that's tolerant to disease, what does that mean? Well, that means that the amount of that disease in the bird population can also be maintained and also increase. Now, in this particular case, when we talk about this, and most of the encephalitises and these other viruses are bird-borne. We call them arboviruses, and so when the mosquitoes run out of birds to feed on, they go, well, what else can I feed on? And if they happen to pick somebody like a human being, or in the case of some of these viruses, things like horses and livestock can also get these diseases, and that's why one of them, these encephalitis, we call one of them St. Louis equine encephalitis, because it was actually more dangerous to horses than it was to human beings, but human beings can get that disease and cause problems. We've also talked about that there are other types of organisms, not only just viruses, but there are protozoal blood parasites like malaria, and there's even nematodes that can be transmitted. The filarial worms and heartworms are the nematodes that can be transmitted by mosquitoes. So wide variety of organisms, and as you can see, all these organisms pick the mosquitoes because the mosquitoes, now I say they pick the mosquitoes, obviously biologists will say they co-evolve together. with this, and so understand my terminology when I say they picket. It's really an evolutionary arms race that's going on with these diseases and with the mosquitoes. Now, when it comes to mosquito management, this is always a question that I get all the time. The people in my neighborhood know that I'm an entomologist. They know that I know something about these critters, and I still remember about a year after moving in, the neighbor next to me leaned over the fence and she said, "Hey Dave, you're an entomologist, aren't you?" "Yeah." "Why aren't they spraying for the mosquitoes?" And I had to smile, and I had to explain the whole thing about mosquito management to my neighbor for this. Basically, since mosquitoes do vector diseases, they come under the purview of what we call the health control departments or health management districts. And there are national health management districts, there are state health management. We have the state Department of Health, and part of their duties are to take care and monitor these vectors of disease in the state. And then there are local and municipal health management facilities and health departments. And again, to give an example, there's a Franklin County health control department, and basically one of their components, they do monitor other diseases. They're supposed to keep track of social disease outbreaks and other diseases that go on, but a big component of what they do is that they hire usually students during the summertime to do scouting across the area. And they know areas of the county that are mosquito prone, and these scouts will go out, they'll set up traps in those particular areas. They'll trap the adult mosquitoes, but they'll also do inspection of wetland habitats or places that are prone to collect water, and they'll actually go out and do what we call mosquito dipping. That's nothing more than a cup tied to a long pole that you go out and dip the water and see how many mosquito larvae that are in there. Basically, what they do is after those mosquitoes are captured, whether they're the adult mosquitoes or the larval mosquitoes usually just trigger a treatment of the wetland habitats. We have some bio-based material, some Bacillus thuringiensis is the most commonly used material for that you throw it in. It kills almost any fly larvae, but leaves any other aquatic organisms, both insects and other invertebrates, alone. It's non-toxic to them. But the adult mosquitoes are usually on a daily basis. These monitoring people bring them back to the laboratory. They put them under the microscope, and first thing they do, sort them out to genus, which genus of mosquitoes they are. Then certain genera of mosquitoes are ones that are known to transmit the diseases. They'll often pull those aside, identify them to species, and if they think it's the right species that might be carrying a disease, they'll actually freeze them and send them off to a laboratory who will then do a molecular genetic analysis. It used to be we had to do it the old-fashioned way, but now we have molecular genetic techniques where they can just squash the mosquitoes, run a PCR on them, and see if they're carrying particular viruses. And basically, when you get the right species of mosquitoes, and a certain number of them or certain percentage of them are carrying this disease, that's what triggers the fogging. So fogging is not done by these health departments on a nuisance basis. In other words, if you go out in your backyard or on your deck and get 50 bites, they could care less. But if those 50 bites are potentially from mosquitoes of the right species that are carrying a disease, that's when they get concerned. That's when they pull the trigger. That's when they do the fogging and treatments. Now, to me, there are many other reasons to control mosquitoes. Number one, they're a darn nuisance. I have a bad reaction to mosquito bites. I itch like a fiend. I get a red welt from them, and so they're a real nuisance. And it used to be that we only had species that were primarily active right at dusk and just before daybreak. What we call crepuscular species, but now with the Asian tiger mosquito that's here in Ohio, that's one that feeds during the daytime and does very well during the middle of the day. It's a really sneaky species, and it's kind of unusual behavior in that. And there was actually a publication recently that came out on this one. It's one that apparently can visualize the silhouette of its target, and it prefers to approach you from behind. And so it apparently can see your face, and so what it will do is it goes, and it goes, oh, yeah, I need to go back here and approach you. So I get the bites on the back of my arms, the back of my legs, if I've got shorts on, and places like that. I had a pretty bad infestation actually this last summer in my neighborhood, and I knew I was getting bit, and so I was standing on the deck, and I just thought, well, I'm going to try this. And I immediately whipped around real fast, and there were about 5 of them flying around right behind me, and it was very obvious that, and as soon as I turned around, of course, they went, and they went around to the other side of me to approach me that way. We know that scratching, especially among children, can be fairly dangerous. They can break the skin, and you can get secondary skin infections from that. But again, the health department doesn't put this into account. This is something they say, well, you're going to have to deal with that on your own. We're really only worried about the diseases that these things vector, and we really only pull the trigger of our management when the disease incidence begins to occur and reaches a certain level. Now, where do mosquitoes come from? Remember that mosquitoes have a complete life cycle, and in this case, their larvae are aquatic. What's interesting is that neither the larvae nor the pupae of the mosquitoes can live in permanent bodies of water where there are predators, primarily fish. And frankly, that's one of the common ways of managing things like mosquitoes in your backyard. Seems like the big in thing now in many suburban areas is to have a water feature in your backyard. And of course, I take my typical bug doc view of that. What is this water feature? It's nothing more than a plastic bathtub that you've thrown out there with a pump in it. And of course, if it's not managed correctly, if you don't have any fish in there, or it's not permanently managed well enough that there are predatory insects in there, it's going to be a wonderful place for mosquito larvae and pupae to come in. Now, generally in most locations, where are the biggest areas of food and water? Well, it's what we call the floodplain areas. And there's actually an interesting group of mosquitoes. There's one genus of the mosquitoes in which the adult female mosquito will actually lay her eggs by attaching them to the soil in the areas that will eventually get flooded. And so they sort of can predetermine by analyzing the habitat, this is going to be a good place to put my eggs, because as soon as the rain comes, there will be temporary water here that will allow for my larvae to develop their or finish their development. Most people, when we talk about managing it around the homes, they know that things like the rain gutters, if those get clogged up, and of course now is a primary time that those get clogged up from the leaves and things that are falling from the trees, but they need to be inspected usually at least twice a year. I recommend inspecting them in the springtime, and again right after the leaf fall of the trees. Make sure they're not clogged up and water is staying in there. people's little kiddie pools, dog dishes, almost anything, even just something as small as a green bean tin can that's out in the backyard, or a soda can that just got tossed out of somebody's car that landed upright, that can get maybe a couple of inches of water in there is enough for mosquitoes to develop their habitat or develop their larvae. Now, with all that said, the primary place for most of the mosquitoes that are in our suburban neighborhoods are in this last one: storm sewer settling tanks. So you may know what a storm sewer settling tank is. Okay, you all know where you've got your roads, and then there's these grates where the rainwater goes down. Well, that rainwater goes into a settling tank. The first thing that happens underneath each one of those grates along the road, there's this big concrete tank. They're usually about 4 foot by 4 foot and up to 6 foot in depth. Now, what does that mean? Well, the water that comes in here first goes in that settling tank. What's in that water that comes off the street? Water. What else? Trash, sand, grit, debris, leaf litter, all that stuff. And all that stuff can clog up the storm pipes, the water pipes that have to carry that water away. So what this settling tank does is that all that debris with the water goes into this tank, and this tank is designed in such a manner that it can hold several hundred gallons of water in there. It's not until that tank fills up to the top that then the clean water runs down the storm sewer pipes and take it out. Typically now, since we've separated our sewer pipes from the storm runoff pipes, it'll just take it off to the local rivers and other waterways and places like that. But if you think about it, that settling tank is just an ideal place for mosquitoes to breed, because especially the organic matter, the leaf litter, grass clippings, things like that get in there, begin to ferment and rot, produce bacteria, and it's really the bacteria in the water is what the mosquito larvae are feeding on. So the reality is the vast majority of mosquitoes in your neighborhood come from your local settling tanks along the road. Now, I find it also interesting, because of the nature of those settling tanks, if we have steady rainfall events, in other words, we get a rainfall event every week that's maybe a half an inch of water or so, what typically happens is that those tanks will fill up with water, and the top of them will keep running downstream, and since these mosquito larvae and pupae have to remain at the top of that water in order to breathe, they get washed downstream into the river, and what's going to happen to them in the river? Fish are going to pick them off, okay? And so they disappear that way. So I find it interesting in most summers where we've had a rainfall event and then the rain stops for about 2 weeks, all hell breaks loose at that time, because you need about 7 to 14 days for the larvae to finish their development and come out, and so it's usually not during continuous rainfall events, but it's where we've had some rainfall events and then about a 2-week period of no rainfall is when we have major mosquito outbreaks. Here's just a picture that I've borrowed from the state. We've got a couple of vector control people with the state health department, and so Brian Massery developed this one a few years ago, and just to show all the different kinds of habitats that they've got to monitor and look at in order to determine where these mosquitoes are coming from. Now, adult mosquitoes are fairly delicate flyers. They're not real strong flyers. As a matter of fact, one of the ways that we'll talk about controlling mosquitoes is to actually use fans. Most mosquitoes will stop flying if the wind is 5 miles an hour or higher. They just can't fly upwind when it's that strong. Now, most mosquitoes will live within, they'll generally forage within a mile of wherever the water source is that they're going to lay their eggs. And so the reality is if you've got mosquitoes that are in your backyard, they probably came from a very close region around there. Now you know they probably came from the roadway out front where you have one of those settling tanks around. Now there are a few species where I grew up in Oklahoma. We had some very notorious species there that we call floodplain mosquitoes, and those are ones that will travel considerable distances from those floodplains to find a blood meal, and then they'll have to return back to those floodplains to lay their eggs. If we take a look at just Columbus here, I mean, all you have to do is just take a look at a neighborhood like this, and you can imagine all of the potential sites, both in the suburban areas here, in the industrial areas here. We can see some athletic fields. Typically on either side of the athletic fields, there's going to be drainage areas and places like that. They sculpt those so that the rain runs off of the surfaces over into the waterways next to them. And so we've got plenty of places that the mosquitoes can breed and come with. Now, some of the other basics about mosquitoes, both males and females can survive feeding on nectar. When a female mosquito cannot find a blood meal, she will take nectar from flowers. And what are we saying that everybody should have in their yards now? Pollinator habitat. What does that mean? Lots of flowers with lots of nectar. And so, again, as an entomologist, I always have to kind of smile when I see well-meaning people doing things that they think are good, but then they don't consider the full impact of planting a whole bunch of flowers in their landscape that bloom continuously during the season. And yeah, that's great for the pollinators, but it's also great for the mosquito survival. Remember that the mosquitoes in general, the females need a blood meal in order to produce their eggs, but there's been some recent reports coming out that they're showing some instances where the females can produce eggs even without a blood meal. They'll produce fewer eggs, and those eggs may have a harder time developing, but there are some that seem to be able to make it through even when they can't find a place to do their blood meals. Now let me make a little sidetrack here. There are hundreds of different species of mosquitoes. Each mosquito usually has a preferred host. There are mosquitoes that prefer frog blood. There are mosquitoes that prefer lizard blood, snake blood, bird blood, and so forth. And I find it interesting that they usually, while they prefer that host, if they can't find that host to get their blood meal, they'll take other hosts and take blood from them. Remember again that the larvae are filter feeders. They're feeding out bacteria and single-celled algae that's growing in basically stagnant water that has organic matter and other materials in it. The life cycle of the mosquito, again, it's a complete life cycle. So we've got the adult female. Once she takes a blood meal, she'll lay her eggs, and again, different species of mosquitoes lay their eggs in different manners. Most of them attach their eggs to the water. Some of them lay their eggs in what we call rafts. There'll be little masses of eggs, and you can see there's easily 100 to 150 eggs in that little raft. But there's others that will lay their eggs singly on the water surface, or they may even attach them to the grass blades and weedy materials that are at the edge of the water, and as the water rises, those eggs will come into contact with the water. The larvae are kind of interesting, and another name for the larvae is wiggler. And the reason why it's called a wiggler is that if you've ever seen them, they snap the body back and forth. So it looks like they're flip-flopping back around in the water, wiggling back and forth. The larvae have a air tube, just like, remember that we'd mentioned the maggots only have a pair of anterior spiracles and a posterior spiracle. In the case of the materials, they have their posterior spiracle attached to an elongated tube, which you can see right here. And that tube has kind of an interesting circle of hairs that have a heavy waxy coating on them. So when the mosquito larva comes to the surface and hits the surface tension of the water, that waxy coating breaks open the surface tension so they have direct access to the air. Now, does anybody know one of the old ways of getting rid of mosquito larvae in water? Pardon? Yeah, they used to put light oil or something like kerosene on the water. And what that's to do is that when the larvae would come up, when the little hairs would come into the water, that oil film, that would clog up those air tubes or not allow it to break the surface tension and get the air. And so that was an old technique. It's still used in many countries today, but we don't like the idea of spreading oils out in our temporary water and things like that. There are other ways that we manage them now. Now, once the larva goes through its several instars, again, 3 or 4 instars for these, they will have to pupate. And the pupae are called tumblers. And as you can see, the pupa is more rounded. You can see where the head, the wings, and the leg are beginning to form up in the thoracic and head area. What's interesting there is that instead of the posterior spiracle being active, now the 2 anterior spiracles have little elongated tubes, and you can see what looks like little horns sticking up here, right here and right there, are actually those anterior spiracles that are the breathing tube. So when the tumblers, they flip their abdomen, and so they sort of spin around or tumble around, but when they're ready to get oxygen again, they'll just float up to the surface. And again, there's a little circle of hairs on the tips of those tubes that break the surface tension and allow water. But if you have an oil on that surface, that would clog those also. Now, Denise is going to spend more time on these, but I just, again, wanted to mention them. Now, what we mean by arboviruses is that these are viruses that are arthropod transmitted, and most of them are actually bird viruses. They're ones that the endemic population of these viruses live in the bird population, but occasionally when the mosquitoes can't find enough bird hosts to feed on, they'll feed on other animals. If they pick that virus up from the birds, feed on the other animals, they have the possibility of transmitting those diseases to other animals. And you'll probably recognize some of these, like Eastern equine encephalitis, St. Louis cephalitis. The most recent one that's been imported into North America was the West Nile virus. Another one that's not very common here in the United States is dengue. But we're seeing some cases of this now occurring down in the Gulf states, and so we're a little bit worried about those. There's another one not mentioned in here, chikungunya, which is found in many other countries, but showing up here. I have to treat my dogs on a regular basis because my dogs do go out during the summertime. We take them with us when we go visit my daughter down in Florida during the wintertime, and so they're on a constant heartworm medicine to make sure. It's basically a nematicide. Now, what's a nematicide? Something for nematodes. So I give them a pill, and they now have a topical spot for dogs. But basically, I give them a pill that it's a long-standing nematicide that stays in their blood system. So if a mosquito bites them and those little infective juvenile nematodes try to get into the blood system, they're killed off before they can develop. And so that's a preventive technique to do that. Then we have some of these other diseases. Now, I find it kind of interesting. If you're a history buff, there were a lot of soldiers that died in the Civil War from malaria and yellow fever. Why? We had both of those diseases here in the United States. How did we get rid of it? I find this kind of interesting. We drained most of the swampland areas that got rid of the mosquitoes that were transmitting these diseases. And once we got the vector population down to a certain level, those diseases actually disappeared. And that's one of the strategies for managing some of these diseases. If you can get the vector population down to a low enough level that the disease isn't being picked up by them and transmitted, it's one way to control it. But in many countries where they don't have large area-wide mosquito control, it's impossible to do that. And of course, some of the other diseases that are appearing here, the filariasis and Zika. The Zika obviously is the one that appeared most recently. Again, what are your chances of getting any of these diseases? Here in Ohio, your chances of getting any of the encephalitises is moderate to high. Now, fortunately, especially the West Nile virus, for the average human, that disease usually appears as a mild flu, if any symptoms whatsoever. Encephalitises, likewise, I test positive for all of these. Apparently, I've had them all. At one time, I don't remember having any of them, but I test positive for all of those. I've got antibodies for all those diseases. I figure it's because I spent most of my time as a kid in Oklahoma running around collecting bugs and getting bit like mad by mosquitoes all the time. Probably got it and didn't even know it. Being a kid, I probably had a little fever for a day or two, but just blew it off. As I indicated, dengue, you would have to go down to the Gulf states in order to potentially be exposed to that one. We don't have the right mosquitoes or the right sort of a life cycle for dengue here up in Ohio. When it comes to heartworms, indeed, we do have a high endemic population of alternate hosts for that. What would be an alternate host for a dog and cat heartworm? That's a canid. Nobody knows this? What? We don't have wolves here. What do we have? Coyotes, absolutely. We have a really rebounding population of coyotes. I know over where I live in Hilliard, there's a couple of parks right in my backyard, and about 3 years ago, I started hearing some coyote howling out in the field. So I know that there's coyotes out there. We've actually had to shoot some coyotes over here at Waterman Farm. I think our manager is up to. I think he told me that he had killed at least 12 coyotes just on the Waterman Farm complex. So again, they don't get treated on a regular basis, but they're very susceptible to heartworms. And so again, if they're in the neighborhood, mosquitoes feed on them and then come feed on your dog, you're liable to have the dog get those heartworms. Now, what is the typical, I've talked about these as being arboviruses and the cycles. I'm going to pick on the West Nile virus. I've already mentioned this, that the West Nile virus is actually a disease of birds, and the bird population can harbor this disease. They get it transmitted among themselves. The mosquitoes that feed on them prefer bird blood as their primary food, but when either the mosquito population gets too high or the bird population gets too low, occasionally we get what we call incidental infections, and that's where an infected female mosquito that picked up the virus from the bird happens to feed on a human being or some of our domestic animals, and then they transmit the diseases there. Just so happens with the West Nile virus that livestock, especially horses, are much more susceptible. They get a very severe flu-like symptom from this, but also fortunately the veterinarian community has developed a serum for this, and so they can vaccinate the horses. The problem with the serum is that it only lasts for a year or two, and so you have to get your horses re-vaccinated on a fairly regular basis in order to keep your horses from getting that disease. We've already talked about the heartworms, and in this particular case, I find it interesting. The heartworms being a nematode get into dogs, and so having dogs outside that are untreated, again, it's amazing the number of people that have pets and really don't take care of them. They don't take them to the veterinarian. Most vets will. It's kind of again, it's interesting. When I was a kid, the veterinarian required you to bring the pet in once a year. Now our veterinarian says that we want to see your animal 4 times a year. I keep thinking, well, they just want more money from me, but the reality is they do need to keep checking them for these both intestinal parasites and blood parasites, and make sure that they don't get infected. If they do get infected, if they treat them early enough, then you don't cause major problems from heart congestion and circulatory congestion. I find it interesting that cats can get the heartworm, but the cat blood system is designed in such a way, and the makeup of cat blood doesn't allow for the microfilariae, in other words, the little larval heartworm nematodes to survive. And so while a cat can get the heartworm, it can develop into a full-blown adult that can get into the heart and clog the circulatory system. Cats can't transmit the heartworm to a mosquito. If they get bit by another mosquito, the mosquito don't pick up the microfilariae. So it's kind of interesting that, as they say here, it's a transient host as opposed to a viable host. Now, talked about the pest control agencies, and again, these are both the state and local pest control agencies. What most of you see is the fogging that you'll hear in the middle of the night, this truck going by with the fogger going out there. But generally, they before they even start that, a lot of their surveys are going to be visual inspections of places where water may collect. And they actually work. The agencies work together here. That the health department, if they see a particular area that gets filled up with water and that water stands there, then they'll have to call the other agencies of that municipality and say, we've got a drainage area here that keeps getting filled up. You need to go back out and regrade that or fix it up so that the water effectively drains out of there. We don't have much aerial application, but in Oklahoma, this was a big deal where we had big floodplains from our rivers. Many of the health departments there did do aerial spraying of mosquitoes. We don't normally see that here, but it even has occasionally occurred, especially down in the Cincinnati area where we've got the big Ohio River floodplains that need to sometimes be treated. Yeah. Yeah, the statement here is that and I was one of those kids as a kid when the foggers finally came in. We used, oh yeah, it's here, and we'd always run behind the truck by that. I would not recommend it. Most of the material that's in there is a very low rate pyrethroid insecticide that's used for that, but they've now gone to some other insecticides that are insect growth regulators. And the interesting thing about these insect growth regulators is that they don't rapidly kill the adult mosquito, which, well, rats, but what it does is it will sterilize the mosquito. So the mosquito female that comes into contact with that spray can't lay eggs. And so I've had some communities where they've started using some of these alternate insecticides. They sprayed last night and I'm still getting bit like hell. And I'm going, well, yeah, that's because they're using a different insecticide that didn't kill the mosquito, so it can still bite, but it can't produce viable eggs. For residences and beetles, or beetles, businesses, we recommend that you do a regular water audit. Where is water standing? I'm at the point right now at my house in Hilliard. We've noticed that there's an area in our backyard that seems to be collecting water, and it seems to drain out pretty rapidly. But I'm thinking of putting in a French drain there to drain that water back out to the front and get rid of it so that there's no standing water at any time in there. But again, the most important things here are the culverts at the side of the road in front of your house or behind your house, the roof drainage areas, places like that. But also remember that if you've got trees that branches have been cut off of them, and that branch where it was cut off is rotted and there's a void in there, that can be a real potential area for mosquitoes to breed. And there's a really interesting one. There's a giant tree-hole mosquito, Toxorhynchoides. I swear that mosquito's over an inch long. It's a really big rascal, and it's a ferocious biter. But it's kind of interesting is that it's not implicated in transmitting any of the diseases. And so while it's a nasty mosquito, a ferocious biter, it doesn't transmit diseases. So it's usually not on the radar of the vector control people. Some of the other things that are recommended and not recommended. Bug zappers are not recommended. There's been numerous studies that have been published on those bug zappers, and generally in most cases 99% of what a bug zapper zaps is innocuous nighttime flying beetles and moths. And the reason for it is the light's too bright. When mosquitoes approach that light and there's a certain intensity of the light, it actually shuts off their flying. And so they rarely even reach that trap. There are other traps that are out there. Some of these can be fairly effective. Most of them, the one shown here in the middle here, use a CO2 generator. They'll basically use natural gas in order to generate some carbon dioxide, and these seem to be pretty attractive to the mosquitoes. They've got a little internal fan that when the mosquito gets close to the CO2 generator, the fan has a high enough volume of air that it sucks them into a little trap and bag. That's the kind of traps that most of the cities and states use, are CO2 generators. What's interesting to me is that these generators often have about a 2 to 3 watt light bulb in them, and unless you're looking for it, you almost don't see it. It's just this little tiny light. And I've asked mosquito specialists, why in the world do they have the light? And they say they've done studies. Apparently mosquitoes are attracted to lights at night, but it has to be a very dim light. And they believe that it's actually the light that's reflected from the eyeballs of animals at nighttime. It's the moonlight and starlight. And I go, okay, but that was hard for me to believe, but apparently there's been publications that have studied this and indicated that. There are Residential spray systems, I don't see these very commonly here, but this is actually my sister's backyard in Houston, Texas. I don't recommend it because basically about 4 times a day this little mister comes on and mists her backyard with a pyrethroid insecticide to keep the mosquitoes at bay. And since she doesn't have much of a backyard with a bunch of flowers and things in it, I'm not really worried about her killing all the pollinators and other insects there, but I just don't like the idea of sitting in their backyard drinking my mint julep in the evening, and all of a sudden this thing comes on and sprays this insecticide mist around me. But they're quite effective. They do a very good job. My feeling is the best control, if you want to use a physical, mechanical job, is use fans, and we're recommending this more and more. You'll see a lot of the restaurants that have summer outdoor feeding areas will have overhead fans now. And you're probably just assuming that that's to keep you cool out there. While it does that, but it also, if you can have at least sort of a steady 5-mile-an-hour wind or slightly higher, the mosquitoes can't fly upwind to that. In commercial facilities, there are what we call air curtains. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but some stores even have them. Whereas the doors open, you hear this and you get sort of a blowing of air in your face. That is an air curtain, and that's to keep flying insects out. Not only mosquitoes, but other flies won't fly upwind with those. And we actually have them in our research facilities. We now have some new scientists in our department, and their research labs, when you go through the door, you hear this whoosh of air going on, and it's these air curtains making sure in those cases only the front door has an air curtain blowing out. On the inside, they've got air curtains blowing from the hallway in to make sure if any mosquitoes escape in the laboratory, they get blown and stay in the laboratory. There's a lot of insecticides. Most of the treatments that you're familiar with are the adulticiding, but the reality is the vast majority of work for mosquito control is what we call larviciding. These are insecticides that are used in and around wetland habitats to kill those larvae before they develop. How about repellents for personal? The reality is, no matter what you've heard about citronella candles, they're not going to be very effective unless you literally surround yourself with the citronella candles. And if you've got any airflow, that's going to blow the vapors of the citronella away and go too far down. There's many repellents that you can put on your skin. Now, I'm allergic to DEET, so I have to use Picaridin, but there are some new herbal materials that are out there that apparently are fairly effective. The beauty of DEET is that DEET will often last anywhere from 4 to 6 hours from a single application. Picaridin and the herbals usually only last about an hour to an hour and a half, so you have to repeat putting those on there. Now I'm going to have to change this. There were a bunch of these personal bands and tags. They were basically sort of like a flea collar piece of plastic that you attach to your cap or to your jacket or something like that. It was supposed to create this aura of the insecticide around you and kill them. Those were proven not to be effective. However, this last year, there was a new little releasing, it's a battery-operated gizmo that basically releases a vapor of the insecticide around you. Again, I'm not sure I like the idea of inhaling insecticide all the time, but that one now has been proven to be quite effective. And a lot of people that work a lot outdoors or do hunting and fishing are tending to use that. Also remember that mosquitoes can hear sound. What's the sound that mosquitoes can hear? Remember that they have a Johnson's organ at the base of the antennae, And basically the sound that they hear is the vibration of the wing beat. That's what they're designed to do. They do not hear ultrasonics. They do not hear other sounds like bats and things like that. So there are sound devices out there that say you put these on the porch, they release ultrasonic sounds that repel mosquitoes. Bull. Not going to happen.